Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of After School. I'm Mark and I'm the animator behind this channel. Today we'll be watching a clip from my podcast with Daniel Schmachtenberger. I thought this clip was so good that I figured I'd animate it and put it on this channel. So without further ado, let's dive in.
It's so easy if we're not in the place where collapse is happening to think that it won't ever happen because we don't have an experience of it, so we don't have an intuition for it, even though the history is that every empire in the history of the world collapsed. That right before it collapsed, it was usually at its height. That the people at that time didn't think it was going to happen, so they weren't doing any smart kind of guidance or preparation. They were continuing to live in the way that advanced what caused it to collapse directly. So we can be more foresightful than that. It would be nice if we were more foresightful than that. And I'm saying that the timelines of the issues facing the world are such that if people are paying attention right now, they will realize there are things that are much bigger issues than the things you're dealing with in your current life that are impending, that orient really deep life reconsideration. If people haven't, everybody should go study the Asch Conformity Studies and the Milgram Experiments, which, I'll just recap very briefly. Milgram Experiments, fascinating behavioral psych, where people were brought in to be part of a scientific experiment. They were told that the experiment had to do with the effects of like electroshock therapy on people. There's a person on the other side of the wall who was going to be receiving a shock. They just had to push the button of the level of shock the scientist was monitoring. And what they were trying to do is understand the effect of electric shock. The reality was the person pushing the button was the test case. The person on the other side of the wall that they couldn't see wasn't actually hooked to electric shock. They were an actor, and every time the button was pushed, they made a noise accordingly. But the people in the study obviously didn't know that. That's why the study worked. And so the scientist, the authority in the situation, said, okay, go ahead and do the shock at this voltage. And they would hear on the other side a groan. And then they'd turn the voltage up and say, now do it. And then turn the voltage up. And the person screams on the other side. And the person who's pushing the button is like, is this okay? Are they all right over there? And the scientist is like, yes, everything is okay. This is what we have to do. This is for science. And a humongous percentage of the people continued to push the button because the authority told them to the point that they actually believed it was killing the person on the other side. And the Asch Conformity Studies are where a whole group of people were all tested together about which line is longer. And they'd put a few lines or which color is darker or something like that. And everybody in the group was an actor except one. But that one person didn't know that. They thought everyone else was part of the study. Everyone else said this line is longer, but it was obviously false, right? Like the other line was longer. And a very high percentage of people had their answer match with what the group said. So going with what the authority dynamic is, going with what the kind of group dynamic is. So when the Nazis were being tried in the Nuremberg Trials for war crimes, this was one of the most fascinating things because when we were talking about population-wide dispositions, the Germans were not always genocidal people. Right. And so it's like, how did it happen that relatively quickly a population of people who were moral human beings, who loved their children, who, were normal people, were now at mass throwing kids in gas chambers? And when they were asked, did you believe that everything you were doing was good? 90% of the Nazis said no. They said, at first we did, but we were just bringing the people to the camps who weren't going to exterminate them and et cetera. And it got worse and worse and worse. And by the end, no, we didn't think it was good. And then they were asked, did you try to stop? And all of them said, no, we didn't try to stop. And when asked why, they all quoted the same German phrases that translate to officers' orders. I didn't really have a choice. When people don't feel like they have a choice, they can be complicit with evil, even if they are not actually evil. When people say, there's nothing I can do about the world situation, it's the same thing. But rather than the Nazis, it's the distributed system that they're being complicit with. All right, well, I'll just keep doing all the things that the system is disposing me to do, buying all of the things that I want on Amazon, having them delivered to my door, and pursuing the cultural status things that marketing tells me to pursue, and etc. Rather than unplug from that thing and say, the Krishnamurti quote, that it's not a good measure of mental health to be well adjusted to a profoundly insane society. If my society is causing the extinction of 10 to 30 species every day, if it is increasing the chemical pollution to the point that everybody's becoming infertile and having autoimmune diseases and cancers and neurodegenerative diseases, if it is rapidly building the most horrifying kinds of weapons possible in arms races, is that a sane society? No, it's a fucking batshit crazy society. Do I want to be complicit with it? Am I willing to be complicit with it? Am I willing to have my spot in the history of the world be at the time when human choice mattered more than any other time? Because previously, you could have the fall of a Roman civilization or the fall of the Ottoman or the fall of the Egyptian vast civilizations, but it still wasn't everything. They were still local civilizations. And you did have civilizations that actually fell because of environmental overreach. That was actually quite common. And the overstripping the environment and your civilization failing is a multi-thousand-year-old story. So you can read books like The Collapse of Complex Civilization by Joseph Tainter that show one of the reasons civilizations collapsed. They'd cut down all of the trees, the topsoil would erode, they would lose agricultural capability, and then they'd stop being able to feed the people. Iceland used to be covered in trees. There's no trees. The Vikings destroyed all the trees. The thing that we think of as Iceland is not Iceland. It's Iceland post-deforestation. Some of the great deserts of the world were the results of early human activity that desertified them. But when we destroyed the environment, it was always just a local environment. It wasn't the biosphere, right? It wasn't the chemistry of the oceans writ large, the atmosphere, the amount of genetic integrity of how many species of soil microbes there are, things like that. There's a study that came out about 6 months ago on PFAS, the fluorinated surfactants, which are basically like, Rain-X and Scotchgard and the stuff that we spray on everything. PFAS is found in rainwater everywhere in the world. It was found in freshly fallen snow in Antarctica. It's found in rainwater on every continent. This is just one category of pollution that we have made so ubiquitous that if you're off-grid collecting rainwater to try to not be part of the system, it's filled with PFAS. And it was at PFAS that was at many times higher than the EPA allowable levels everywhere in the entire world. That's having biological effects, not just on humans, the infertility things, but on the soil microbes, on the algae, on everything, right, on the whole planet. So if you see that we're at a time where we could, that the precedent of history is that civilizations end, and they end for reasons that they helped cause. They end for reasons that had to do with self-termination. And even if you say, well, they were beat by someone else, usually it was also that they engaged in rivalry that engendered those types of dynamics with the other people. And oftentimes they got large enough that they got internal infighting and erosion of how their government worked because of corruption and things like that. Many of the civilizations that fell to opponents smaller than ones that they had successfully defeated earlier because they had already went through internal decay. So the precedent is civilizations end. Their own growth plays a major role in their own end. But for the first time in history, we have a single global civilization where all of the products we depend on take 6 continent supply chains to make. There is no Chinese civilization and US civilization, and all the US stuff depends on Chinese stuff, depends on cobalt that comes from the DRC in Africa, depends upon oil that comes from the Middle East, et cetera. And so all the manufacturing of our needs comes from a global civilization that is in the same process of self-termination. It doesn't have to go that way. We could go a different way with it. You can imagine that none of the Nazis wanted to defect, because if they defected, the idea was they would be killed, right? If they could coordinate and all defect, then there wouldn't have been the genocide in the first place. The ability for people today to realize that the trajectory of the world that we're on is not the trajectory that they want, that they are not willing to be complicit with, that the possibility of changing it is a more potent possibility for meaningful contribution than anyone has ever had in terms of scale. And that's a more worthy use of their life and attention than whatever's currently engaging it. That, I think, is the only sane assessment.
All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to see the full conversation with Daniel Schmachtenberger, you can do so on our other channel, Before School. It was a fantastic conversation, and Daniel really made me reevaluate some of my firmly held beliefs. so I highly recommend it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.